Hello, welcome once again to the Turret of Pleasure here in the Enchanted Kingdom of Hermione. I am the Lord Chamberlain of the Enchanted Kingdom and the host of this program, Zip Gun. And although I kind of promised last video that I'd try to have less of this kind of product, I am sad to announce the passing of yet another rock legend, and I mean legend. And this is days after the not surprising news of the passing of the great Sly Stone. Several days later comes the passing of another great music legend, Brian Wilson. And Brian Wilson was, who of course was mostly associated with the Beach Boys, was an enigmatic figure, and he was embedded in a culture that really was alien to him, I suspect. I mean, not for nothing did he write a song called "I Just Wasn't Made for These Times." And I haven't, with Sly, I read his book before I did my video. I've just finished the Sly book, and now I'm gonna pick up the two autobiographies or biographies I have of Brian, one of which is the almost certainly ghost written by Eugene Landy, Wouldn't It Be Nice, which I bought years ago, and it has since been largely debunked by other sources. I also have a copy of Catch a Wave. I can't remember the fellow who wrote that. And that seems better regarded in the sort of world of rock academia, if you will. And I'm going to give that another peruse. But it always struck me that Brian was maybe autistic a little bit. He just had that thing about him that suggested childlike innocence, always through his entire career. And even though, like Sly, he fell on hard times due to drugs, I don't think drugs were entirely his downfall, but they certainly didn't help. And, the fact that he had so much thrust upon his shoulders at such a young age, and he had lived through what I would consider to be a pretty traumatic childhood. His father, Murray Wilson, who was also the Beach Boys manager in the early days, or for quite a while actually, was just a monster. I mean, there's stories about his behavior that I'm not going to go into here, because he's up there with people like Roy Estrada and Phil Pickett and fucking James Devine and all these fucking horrible monsters that just ruin children. And the three Wilson brothers, who were in the Beach Boys, kind of dealt with it in different ways, and they were treated a little bit differently, I think. Brian was the eldest. Dad just ragged on him. Dennis was kind of the cocky rebel, and I don't know, I guess he got away with it more. And Carl was the baby, and he didn't really get so much of it. But at any rate, Brian grew up, like I say, possibly slightly autistic, certainly terribly abused. And of course, this is California in the 50s. You want to be on the football team, you want to be, you want to join the Marines, serve your country, you want to pick up girls, go surfing, whatever, And so the boys, they were all very musical. Their dad, Murray, had been a very minor success in songwriting. I forget what it was now. And he really fancied himself to know the biz. I've run into these guys. Yeah, I did a single for Boot Records in the 70s, so I know all about the music business. Okay. Murray was kind of like that, and he would browbeat the boys. You're not playing enough, you're playing flat, you're blah, blah, blah. He just bitch. Never any praise, always criticism. It kind of worked because, of course, it instilled in Brian a real perfectionism that maybe bordered on the kind of insane, but there you have it. And Brian, and the reason I keep suggesting he was slightly autistic is he had a way of hearing music that was just plain different. Now, before we get even too far into this, let's point out that the legend of Brian Wilson, when you step back a second, the legend of Brian Wilson is music. We're all going to go, oh, but God only knows. What a great, those beautiful words, they make me cry. He didn't write those words. And in fact, he never wrote the words. And one of the really interesting things about his career is that he was responsible for the music, and from a very early, I think he didn't produce the first record. I think that was Nick Vanette. But after that, he was the record producer on his records. And this is like 1963, which is very, very, very unusual. One of the very first instances of the artist becoming the producer. And he excelled at this. He was detail-oriented. He knew, and he could hear stuff differently. And so as he got going, he started, at first the Beach Boys were a band. Dennis played drums. Al Jardine, who was the only non-relative, played guitar. Carl played lead guitar. Mike, the cousin, sang. Brian played bass. And when they would play live in the very early days, that was basically the lineup. And at one point, Al quit, and one of their neighbors, a guy named David Marks, he joined and played guitar for a hot minute. And I think he was there for an album or so in the early days. And then they either fired him or whatever. Al came back. Yeah, I'd like to come back. Okay. So, but as they had, the first records were about surfing, because surfing was big, and Brian didn't surf, but Dennis surfed. I think maybe the other guys surfed a bit too. So it was like, okay, well, surf music was huge. Dick Dale, guys like that. So they did a song, which if I remember, it was called Surfin'. Did it on a tiny little label locally. People went, hey, not bad, good surfing song. So, encouraged by this, they started doing, Surfing Safari, Surfing USA, Surfer Girl. I can't remember them all. Well, they'll be on this. They'll be on this for sure. Surfing USA, Little Surfer Girl, Surfing Safari, Surfing USA. Yeah, you get the idea. A lot of these are big hits. We all remember them. They're classic, They're on every oldie station. But Brian was no fool. He realized that the surf fad was kind of going away. But he realized that, what else was important in Southern California youth culture? Well, cars. Hot cars. Well, Brian knew full well that what he knew about hot cars, you could stick in a gnat's ear. So he got a friend of his, a guy named Roger Christian. Roger, you know cars. I want to write a song about a car. What's a good car? He goes, well, I don't. So what's a big motor? Well, there's a 409. 409. Okay, 409. Shut down, Gotti, got a little deuce coupe. Yeah, so then they do a record all about cars. This is with lyricist number 2. I forget who did the lyrics on the first record. Might have been Brian, just himself. There were periods where he would do the lyrics, but not always, not very often actually. Okay, so we go through the car record. I think the car album was called Shutdown. Okay, and then, and now I'm trying to remember the chronology of the albums, and I'm not doing very well because there was a lot of them. There was Shutdown, I think, might have been the second or the third album. And the fourth album, I think, if I've got this right, was an album called Today. And Today was different. Today didn't talk about cars or surfing. It still talked a lot about girls and feelings. And, of course, this is because Brian, at about this point in time, had discovered marijuana. He thought a lot in his head about things. And a lot of people think that Beach Boys Today. They think this is a really, like a groundbreaking record. They're probably right. Now I'm looking at this. This is the Good Vibrations box set. This has been out for 1,000,000 years. And you know what? It's everything you really need by these guys in an extremely annoying format. Boy, is this annoying. I loathe this format. However, now I'm trying to find it. Where's the part with the information on it? Gee whiz. Oh, God, it's terrible. It's not here. I guess it's on the disc. There's a lot to really hate about this set. It comes as 4 separate CDs. I got the swirl, that's nice. But the info, let me just see here. They do tell you kind of what's going on, but you got to go fishing for it. At any rate, Beach Boys Today comes out, and by this point, they're also not playing on all the records. Brian needs people with chops and French horns and things like that. So they start, and of course they're starting to make real money. So he starts hiring session people, and since he's in LA and he's got access to the best of everything, he starts to hire the wrecking crew in those days. And things get bigger and bigger and bigger until by the time they're doing songs like California Girls, which is still kind of a surfing record, although it's also a girl record. He was getting much more into girls by this point. He did a great single called The Little Girl I Once Knew, which didn't appear on any album, and it had these endless silences in it that actually kind of killed the radio play, and it's a really good one. But by this point, he was orchestrating records, and his ability to, he would hear sounds and he'd say, well, what I need is 3 double basses. He'd be like, I want a double bass and an electric bass, and I want a bass harmonica or 3, or things like this, stuff that had never really been used together before. And before too terribly long, he had sort of devised a musical signature that was uniquely his. You could always tell a Beach Boy record, often because there'd be a bass harmonica coming in or something, and stuff that people just hadn't done. And I still think to that end he was more than almost anything. He was a composer, but he was an orchestrator. And the more he, like after the Today album, he's experimented with marijuana, and I think Brian was one of those guys. We all know them. Brian should just never have done drugs. It was not good. There was already things not kind of balanced in the poor man's head. I think he had difficulty with girls. He was kind of pudgy, had a sort of a bad self-image, and drugs just kind of turned him into. And of course, like Sly Stone, by this point, he could do pretty much anything he wanted because he was a duper star. And so you combine the drugs, and of course the drugs got better because you're a duper star, and you can book the studio for a month, and nobody will care because, hey, it's Brian Wilson. He's a genius. By this point, he's a genius. And he was a genius. But ultimately, he got to the point where he became so introspective that he did, well, they did the Summer Days and Summer Nights record. That's really the last kind of feel-good Beach Boys album. I think they also did a Beach Boys party and a couple of other really minor things. It was just product, just sticking it out there. And, but the records that really count, like Summer Days and Summer Nights, I think was a really, really solid, probably their best, what I call sunshine record. And then by this point, he was no longer touring with the band. He couldn't do it. And strangely, Glenn Campbell played bass for them for a while. And ultimately, they replaced him with Bruce Johnson, who stuck for a long time and really was a rudder on their boat for a long time. Still is, I think. And he could stay at home and write these little symphonies for the kids. That's actually Phil Spector said that, didn't he? Anyway. He'd sit at home and write these songs, and he always had a lyricist. this point. So if it wasn't Mike Love, I should have double checked all of this, but for the album after Summer Days and Summer Nights, he got a guy, Gary Asher, I think, to write the lyrics. And they wrote it, and I think he told him what he wanted the songs to be about, and then Asher kind of did the hard work. And they wrote and pretty much recorded, while the Beach Boys were on tour, the record Pet Sounds, which has come to be a gigantic, lionized, oh my God. And it is a great record. I mean, it's a great record for me, even though I think it's a bit of an overrated record personally. It doesn't rock at all, I'll tell you that. But it did have 3 amazing singles. And this Wouldn't It Be Nice, again, almost the apotheosis of the Beach Boys Sunshine era. And then there's God Only Knows. Now, God Only Knows is a weird one. Everybody, Brian. Well, Brian didn't write those words. Maybe he wrote this, maybe he wanted God Only Knows to be in the song. I don't know. But at any rate, that was a bit of a wild song because the word God had not been used that way in a pop song before. It was ever so slightly controversial, even though the message is, how can you not like the message? And then there was Sloop John B., which is an old Caribbean Trinidadian. Sloop John B., I think is I can't remember now, a Trinidadian calypso song. And they do this magic arrangement of it. I mean, it's just, you listen to it and, this was all done live off the floor by a bunch of crack musicians who were doing like the 30th take of it. And it's amazing. So, excuse me. And the rest of the record kind of goes through Brian's kind of emotional state at the time. I do believe that's the one with I Just Wasn't Made for These Times on it. He did a song called Hang On to Your Ego, which was so weird and strange that Mike Love refused to sing it. And so they changed it to I Know There's an Answer, which kind of makes sense. It was a difficult record. Taking a song at a time, it's beautiful. I mean, like I said, the singles, when those singles would hit the radio, it was just magic. Taken as a whole, it's a little bit tough to take for me. I'm a rock and roller. By this point, I was listening to the Yardbirds. Now, as a child, I grew up during the 60s, listening to pop music from 1962. And the Beach Boys were always kind of lame. In the early days, like when the Beatles broke, I thought the Beach Boys were just yuck. I didn't like them at all. And they were catchy enough. But, you couldn't take them seriously. They had those striped shirts on. They were nerds when the nerd word hadn't been invented. And, meanwhile, I was getting into things like Talk by the Music Machine and the Yardbirds and, Distortion and, they're singing about good vibrations. But Good Vibrations was really the point where everybody kind of went, wait a minute, these guys are really good. And, but Pet Sounds, I bought the Pet Sounds box years ago, so I'm going to digress briefly. And I'll tell you what, unless you are out of your mind into this record, you don't need this. I didn't mention that the bonus record on this is great because it's all completely mixed up. Like what it says on the little sleeve here does not correspond to where it is. You got to kind of find out. It says that there's 24 tracks. If I remember correctly, there's 32 tracks. But it's full of gems. And the Good Vibrations box really is the best possible overview that exists right now, I think, of the Beach Boys. And disc 4 you'll never play twice. So there you go. But it gives you a little bit of everything. It does have Kokomo, yes. The Beach Boys Pet Sound Sessions is very much bits and pieces. Now, if you want to know how he put together a record during his glory years, You want to listen to that and study it like a archaeological piece, because that's really what it is. It's not very easy listening. I have not listened to it 3 times. I've listened. There's a couple of bits in it that I quite like, and Glenn Campbell's all over it if I remember right. But unless you're a devotee, you don't need it. The problem with Pet Sounds was it was like, and the Capitol didn't like it, and Capitol kind of didn't really work it very hard, and Brian was kind of paranoid, and then Capitol showed their, God, Capitol were a stupid label. They showed their respect for the band that had made them trillions of dollars by something like 16 weeks after they released Pet Sounds. They put out a greatest hits record, which just killed it right there and then. It was big in England. The English could appreciate it. It still had 3 big hit singles, but no, not good enough for us, say Capitol. We need a bunch of bullshit. We need more like I'm Bugged at My Dad, you know, which is a terrible idea, but I digress. So Brian started getting, you know, sensitive, paranoid even. And he started working on this grand magic project, this amazing project. And to help him with this, he got a guy he knew called Van Dyke Parks. And Van was and is still with us, a really interesting cat. Boy, he is worthy of deep study, I'll tell you. But in these early days, he was kind of a pop songwriter. He hung out with Randy Newman. He'd had a hit, sort of a minor hit that I remember as a kid called Come to the Sunshine, which was just about the happiest song you could ever possibly hear on the radio, even though it didn't really make a lot of sense, because a lot of Van Dyke stuff kind of is just poetry. and good, I like it. At any rate, Brian befriends Van, and there's all these great stories about how Van shows up on his motorbike one day, and Brian goes, "What are you doing riding a motorbike up here?" And he goes, "Well, it's all I got." And so Brian goes, "Well, what do you think a safe, really nice, safe car is?" And Van Dyke goes, "I don't know, Volvo, I guess." And the next day, Brian's bought him a Volvo. You know. Anyways, they put their heads together and they start working on this big project about America, which is great because both Sly and Brian were American, and both in their unique ways, they really defined America during a small period of time. And with Brian, he really wanted to reflect the culture of America, the history, and just, you know, and him and Van Morrison, well, they started doing a lot. If I remember right, it was Speed. Did a lot of Speed, and stayed up for God knows how many days and nights writing lyrics that really defy literal translation. Let's just say they're you know. And there's apparently a classic moment when Mike Love is reading these lyrics, going, "What the hell is this?" And he's asking Van Dyke Parks, who hated confrontations, and he goes to Van Dyke, "What is this?" And I think it's very good poetry. But I can't sing this crap. What the fuck? This over and over, the crow flies. Wah! And so the band hated this stuff. Brian and Van did a whole pile of stuff. And they started to record it the way that Brian was now recording, which was with none of the Beach Boys there at first. And he got tons of stuff down. A lot of it is in the Good Vibrations box. And in fact, probably most of what you need is in this. There's a lot of it. And back when this came out, this was the only place you could get this stuff. Although there is now 2 different Smiles. Brian put one of his own out, which I like but I don't love. And then they finally put together a Beach Boys Smile box, because the Beach Boys Smile sessions got scattered all over the place ultimately. At any rate, Smile was for Brian what There's a Riot Going On was for Sly Stone. It was the bridge too far. He had just lost his fucking mind in drugs and craziness, and you know, the world was his oyster. He had as much money as he needed, etc., etc. And the record just kind of, you know, the record label, come on, we need a record. He's like, and he just kind of collapses. And the record label had even printed covers, I think. And so they're like, oh, fuck, okay. So the band gets together and they go, well, Brian's in bed. He's not coming out of bed. Okay. Well, let's see. So they go, well, Brian won't leave home. Okay, so they build a studio at Brian's basement. Fair enough, 8-track studio. There you go. It's 1960, what, 8? 7? 8. Maybe it wasn't 8 tracks, but it was a proper studio. And so they built this in the hope that they could coax Brian downstairs to work on a new album. Well, they had, during the Smile sessions, they had put together one song that they released as a single, and that was, of course, Good Vibrations, which was just a gigantic hit. And that was, again, that probably was his apotheosis, but he just got it all really together for that song. And then after that, it just kind of started to come unraveled a little bit. That's when the Smile sessions got deep. The band re-recorded some of the Smile songs, but in vastly minimalist and inferior form, and wrote a couple of really terrible other songs. Like there's one where they'll just lay on the floor and hum, and then they put Good Vibrations on the first, and that helped sell it. The record was called Smiley Smile. It's not very good. What does one of them, I think Carl said it was a bunt instead of a grand slam, and he pretty much nails it there. And after this, Brian he was kind of damaged. And so he just stayed at home. The band went out on tour. He helped a little bit with the album called Friends. He did a great song called Busy Doing Nothing because he wasn't doing anything. And it's a nice song, but it's nothing like the stuff he was doing with Pet Sounds and Smile and, Little Girl I Once Knew. And Friends didn't do a thing in the marketplace. The Beach Boys, the whole psychedelic revolution, everything had passed them by. They were utterly passé. Brian was at home, all fucked up. Capitol needed one more record. They gathered a bunch of odds and sods together, including a song by Charlie Manson and a bunch of outtakes from Smile, which are great. Actually made the record listenable. And a few originals by the other guys that you will never want to hear twice. And they put out a record called 2020, and then it turned out they needed one more single. So of all people, Murray, who had been fired by this point, I might add, by the Beach Boys, Murray and Brian got together and wrote one last song called Breakaway, I think it was called. And that was the last single on Capitol, and then that was it. And then they sued Capitol, and it was terrible. And then Murray, who was now no longer representing them at all, managed to browbeat Brian into selling him his publishing. Whereupon he then turned around and sold it to A&M for not a really long, like, if you can try to calculate the value of Brian Wilson's publishing now, my God. At any rate, his dad essentially ripped him off, browbeat him into giving him his fortune, basically, and this all really screwed him up. And they drifted along, and they needed a new record label. So Mo Austin at Warner's, God bless him, he says, well, I'll give him a chance. What the hell? So they get together, and Brian's kind of half functioning, I guess. I'm not sure. And they make a record called Sunflower that literally nobody buys. And it's okay. It's pretty good. Not anything, great. And then Brian starts to slip, and he's not really doing well. And they do another record where he, I think, contributed one song called Marcella, which is okay. It's mostly Carl's record, Carl and the Passions. They finish the record, and it's like everybody's just like, I don't hear a hit. So in order to sell this record, they pair it up with a mono mix of Pet Sounds. Not sure how they got the rights to that. And they lost lead it, basically, with Pet Sounds. It still doesn't do much. Then they go, they get a new manager, Jack Riley, who also becomes a new lyricist. And Jack gets the brilliant idea, we need to leave LA and leave all these people behind because Brian's just, So they go to Holland, where there's no drugs, right? And so they try to make a record in Holland. It's fraught. Brian is just a mess. Like Brian basically sits around and smokes hash all day. They make a record which is okay. I think the big song off of it took 4 people to write, including Van Dyke Parks, and it's sung by their guitar player Blondie Chaplin, so I don't know what's going on. Most of the record's not that good. Or is that after Surf's Up? They did Surf's Up in there as well. Again, a song about a dying tree. There's a great version of Surf's Up, which is of course from the Smile Project, but their 70s output is crap mostly. Or just okay, but not good. And then Brian really just hits rock bottom. And part of their Warner's contract is that he's got to write and produce these records. He's just not capable at this point. So they bring in a guy, Dr. Eugene Landy. And Landy gets him to the point where he can work again, which is all that anybody cares about. And he kind of staggers back into action. He buys a new Baldwin organ. And they do 15 big ones. 15 big ones. Where all he wanted to do was old songs. So they do rock and roll music. They do Palisades Park. Would you believe they have a hit with rock and roll music? Yay! Brian is back! Brian is back! It was the whole campaign, and Brian's like, back from where? Ah! Get away from me! So the record comes out. They kind of try to tour, and Brian shows up for the odd gig. Sometimes he's in his robe at the piano playing, looking like he doesn't know where he is. He goes into a complete relapse. Okay. Well, of course, by this point, the Beach Boys, because they're idiots, have fired Eugene Landy. Hey, good job. Now get fucked. Go away. So they're like, uh-oh, what do we do? Well, I better call Dr. Landy. Landy comes back and says, okay, no, I'm sick of your guys' crap. I get control. Total control. Okay. So he does. He basically lives with Brian. And one of the things he does is he denies him music. He doesn't let him play the piano, locks the piano. They've got a studio, brother studio. Nope. If you're a good boy, if you get up before noon and you have a shower and, all these normal things that normal people do, Brian just wasn't doing them. He wouldn't shower for weeks at a time unless you basically forced him to. He'd turn on this faucet and go, there's snakes coming at me. He was really in a bad way. And Landy kind of coaxed him back into a semblance of normalcy by taking him to the studio, and he would just noodle around doing what he calls his feels. He called them feels. He would just play on the piano and get into a zone. And he'd done this his whole life. And Landy's thing had been like, we want nobody there when we're there. And, you can't record it or anything. We just want to book time. We show up, find the studio empty, and you can play. Well, of course, the Beach Boys, because, they're fucking assholes. They were recording these sessions. And Landy noticed a little, what's that? Somebody in the control room. So he notices that there's a microphone set up for all this. And he just takes a pair of scissors and cuts it, which, of course, freaks everybody out. And, but as things go, and, Brian's like, I can't write. Well, write a song about anything. What bothers you? My daughter's using my toothbrush. Write a song about it, sure. I really like a blowjob. Write a song about it. What the fuck? And he ended up writing some songs about things like Johnny Carson and his love of the solar system and whatnot. And ultimately, he got back into the swing of working with music. And he started to, because it was just him, he'd be like, he'd had this big Baldwin organ he bought. It's just a monster thing. So he'd do a lot of things on that, like, oh, yeah. And then he'd go, well, this needs a bass line. Well, what do you got here that does a bass? Well, there's this Moog synthesizer. So he did all the bass on the Moog, which was pretty neat and innovative. He didn't play drums, but he played a snare drum on some songs. And for the most part, all the Beach Boys did was come in and do the backing vocals. There's a couple of songs, they do a version of Cotton Fields, but by and large, this is basically an album of Brian's demos when he was crazy. And I actually love this album. It's charming. His voice is really, really, really shot. Like, he really wrecked his voice during this era. He was just all about excess. He'd smoke 1 million cigarettes. He'd drink 4 pots of coffee. He'd eat 3 steaks. And he was the same with drugs, so he really And of course, he ballooned in weight and his, yeah. But this record, it at least they got a record out of it. They put it out. It didn't do a thing. Warner Brothers hated it. It has a couple of great moments on it. It has a song about Johnny Carson. It has a song about the solar system. It's got a couple of, but there's still the sound, even with the limited palette of instruments, you can still hear his beautiful orchestral voice. And then basically after that, you get what I call disc 4 of the Good Vibration set. You get what came after that. They all decided, okay, we got a novel idea. We're gonna leave LA to make a record, which they'd already done, which didn't really work. But this time they were going to go to a place very near and dear to Mike Love's heart, and that was MIU University in Fairmont, Iowa, I believe it is, or the Maharishi International University. And they made what is possibly the blandest record in all time, called the MIU record, and Brian kind of played a lot of ping pong and sort of contributed a bit here and there. And finally, Warner Brothers had just said, God, we give up. So they're stuck without a label. Bruce Johnson hadn't been in the band for a while. He had gone to do things like I write the songs for Barry Manilow. He started a label called Equinox I don't know anything about. But by this point, they really, Bruce, we need you. So they get Bruce back on board. He manages, or somehow they manage to get a deal with CBS, Custom Caribou label. Bruce gets the bright idea to take one of their older songs and they'll do a remake and make a disco version out of it, because disco was really big. That kind of worked, not really. But with much fanfare. Oh, Beach Boys, new label. Yeah, the Light album comes out. L.A. And it was okay. It was, again, bland. And really, from that point on, I forget. A friend of mine reminded me of one of their records, and I can't even remember the name of it now. I was going to say, do you remember Rock and Roll Radio? But that's the Ramones. Anyway, something along those lines. That is a sort of a return to form, I guess. But poor old Brian, by this point, he was just bent out of shape. And he sort of didn't do much for a while. And then he came back with he got a deal with Seymour Stein of Sire. And he did this record just called Brian Wilson, which had a song on it called Love and Mercy, which is probably the best song he wrote post Beach Boys. He basically, I think, got fired from the Beach Boys because, I don't remember the exact details, but he kind of wandered through the wilderness for a while. Hooked up with Sire Records, hooked up with a guy named Andy Paley, and sort of started to go back to like Smile kind of stuff. There's a suite on it called Rio Grande that's kind of like the Smile stuff. Rekindled his interest in Americana. And then a little while later, and he did a second record for them that didn't get released. It apparently had the worst rap song on it ever, which I cannot remember the name of. It's out there it's really bad. It's worse than Rodney Dangerfield's, I think. Anyways, that was mercifully suppressed by the powers that be. And then, I don't know what happened. He didn't do anything for a while. Then Don Was did a movie called I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, or at least participated in a movie. And they did a soundtrack where basically they did a pile of his classic songs, but they re-recorded them with, I'm pretty sure Don was producing. And it's all fine, but it tells us nothing we didn't already know, really. So it's just a great big nostalgia trip. And then finally, his old pal Van Dyke Parks phoned him up one day and he said, I got a bunch of songs. I really like them, but I don't like the way my voice sounds on them. I want to hear you on them. So he got Brian to come in and just sing on an album called Orange Crate Art. And sadly, by this point, Brian's voice is pretty shot. But he tries. And he does it with real love. And it's an album that I wish I liked more than I do. But just the fact that it exists is sort of a great thing. And then he kind of, retired. I don't know. What did he do? He went up and down. He was here and there. He did. He started doing solo albums. They're all kind of much of a muchness. He did a version finally of "Smile," and he did it for None Such, and it was weird. It was great to hear it, kind of the way he alleges that he meant it to be. But it sounds like, I don't know. It sounds like Tommy being done by a symphony orchestra. It's a little bit. These guys are pros. They're not the Wrecking Crew, but they're playing the notes off the paper perfectly, and it's all great. But of course, people like me got what they wanted ultimately. A few years later, when they put out the Capitol version of the Beach Boys' "Smile" record, which is pretty much everything you would want, and it's terrific, and it's probably his finest moment. Like I say, it's that moment when he went beyond the edge, and by this point he was like, he's not coming back. And then he made "Smile" while this was all happening, and then that was just the crash and the burn, and everything after that was kind of retreat, if you will. He continued to make solo records right up until, I forget what his most recent one was. They were all terrific, cheery. I mean, it seemed that his subject matter really didn't change after the big crash. He just, love and mercy is what we need tonight, which is like, yeah, okay. I still think, and of course, don't forget, in these records, for the most part, I think he was writing the lyrics. So his true greatness for me is the way he orchestrated pop music, post-Beatles, I guess you could say. Like, what he was doing was much more out there than what the Beatles were doing in orchestrating, because the Beatles' orchestrations were, for the most part, done by George Martin, who was a fabulous musician and really knew what he was doing. But he was no Brian Wilson when it comes to putting instruments and sounds together. Brian just had that thing where he could do it. And that, for me, his moment. What's the moment for Brian Wilson? I don't know. That's a tough one. What's the song? Maybe Wouldn't It Be Nice? Maybe is his real. Well, actually, Good Vibrations, I suppose. Wouldn't it be nice? I think for me is the moment, because that really tells you everything you need to know about both the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson in one song. Anyways, again, a long goodbye, 50 years probably, where he just sort of diminished, and he tried. He played here in Victoria years ago. Apparently it was wonderful. Huge orchestra with him. Very much a nostalgia trip, of course. I didn't go because it was very expensive, and those kind of things rarely move me sufficiently to put big money into it. And but he was a really good heart. Like Sly had a good heart, and I'm glad he was able to end his years in comfort with family around him, and he apparently had quite a happy life for the last couple of decades, and that's great, because he'd been pretty badly treated as a child. And I don't even know what he died of. Actually, I don't know what either Sly or Brian died of. Probably old age. 82 is a good innings for guys that have gone through what they went through. So there you have it. Brian Wilson. Here, let's hear it for you. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. I promise it will be nothing. It won't be just obits. Promise. I'll come up with something else to talk about. Take care of each other. We're not here forever. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications and stuff, and that way whenever I do commit these to whatever MP4s, you'll hear about them. Take it easy. We'll talk to you later.